All right, so let's talk a little bit about Japan here. See if we can get this PowerPoint pulled up. So we're going to be talking about Japan in the early modern era, obviously. So our bell ringer here, this is about Qing China. Previous to this, we talked about the transition from Mongol rule to the rebellion with the Ming and the Qing Empire. So we're looking at this picture and hopefully we're noticing some features of the Qing or Manchu culture. Remember we said the Qing were the Manchu tribe nomads that came in and replaced the Ming. And the main thing we can see here with that is the hairstyle. Or how the Qing kept their own hairstyle. Just an example of them not necessarily integrating into the Han Chinese culture, but retaining some parts of their own culture. And we said that was kind of a continuity of the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols didn't really take on all elements of Chinese culture. They kind of borrowed the Confucian exam system, not the exam system, the Confucian bureaucratic model, but hired more foreigners that led to some, infighting, some people being not so happy. So we can see here the culture of the Manchu with the hairstyle, and we see with the technology that the Ming and Qing are not industrializing to the extent that the West will be doing. When we talk about, Great Britain, but really most European countries at this time, and the scientific revolution, which we'll talk about later, the Qing and Ming don't really do that as much. And the primary reason is just because of the large population that they have. Whereas in Europe, you've got a bunch of different states kind of competing for control. In China, you've got one state, the Chinese state, run by a dynasty. And that dynasty has access to a large population to do labor. So you don't need labor-saving innovations or technologies like in Europe. And we'll talk a lot about that later. So let's get into Japan. So we're going to start with the Sengoku period. We're in the early modern era, right? We call this Japan's Warring States period. So if you remember back to China's Warring States period and how at the end of the Eastern Zhou, just all these different regions were fighting each other. Well, it's the same thing with Japan, pretty much. You can see in the bottom right the territories of various daimyo, the daimyo being lords. My picture in the top right is from Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. That's a video game coming out in March 2019. But we can see all of these daimyos vying for control. So this begins with the collapse of the Ashikaga shogunate. The shogunate, kind of like a warlord who presides over the daimyo, who preside over the samurai, who are over the peasants, and then at the very bottom you got merchants. We're going to see that a little bit later in the slide too. But Japan is really being divided. The emperor doesn't really have much power. He's not going forward at all really until, well, we'll get to the 1800s later. So during this period, the daimyo are challenging each other. The daimyo is just the term for lords. So you think like European lords, the European feudal structure where lords had their manors, daimyo would have their castles in the different territories. And the Sengoku period, the Warring States, comes to an end when the shogunate is restored. And there's three kind of guys that succeed each other in doing that: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Hideyoshi is important for moving the capital to Tokyo, what we would call Edo back then. And this kind of starts the Edo period of Japan's history when Tokugawa Ieyasu restarts the shogunate. So Tokugawa would be the family name. Ieyasu is kind of his first name. That's a way of thinking about that. Tokugawa Ieyasu kind of unifies the country again. So the daimyo begin losing a little bit of power. They have a lot of power during this Warring States period because they're all conflicting with each other. There's no centralized rule. Now the shogunate's kind of restoring that, so the shogun will be at the top. So we call this, the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period. Capital's at Edo, the Tokugawa family's in control, and the shogunate. And this really brings a lot of peace to the country. Whereas before we've got, 2 centuries of civil war, basically. Initially, the shogun's going to be somewhat popular because of the peace and stability that he's bringing. So the shogun's a warlord. He's in control of the state. He keeps control of the daimyo by separating them from their families, basically taking their families hostage to maintain loyalty. Now, that might seem a little weird, right? Well, you're going to take my family, and that's how I'm going to remain loyal. But if the daimyo are separated from their clan, and they have real no hope of establishing their own state, then they're going to be somewhat loyal to the head of the state, the shogun here. So the daimyo begin losing power. The samurai are slowly phased out of the warrior culture. So the samurai are still going to be around, but now they're just kind of government workers. You think of them as like tax collectors with swords and fancy armor. They're really not the samurai we like to think of in the West. You know, we kind of mythologize that. But going forward, they're just kind of tax collectors. Now, towards the end of the Edo period, the shogun begins to lose control, and the daimyo begin to reassert their control. So try not to get that confused. You know, when the shogun restores Japan, he is in control. The daimyo are losing control. As the shogunate goes forward, the shogun loses control, the daimyo gains more control. And the country is really going to be destabilized going into the 1800s when the United States goes through their industrial revolution and shows up and kind of destabilizes the country even more. We'll get to that next unit. But you can see here, even though the shogun restores the country, it's not a perfect centralized state. Commercially, while the Japanese were initially welcoming of trade, the shogun's really going to kind of reverse that. They are interested in some European goods. You know, silver and guns are always going to be a medium of exchange for Europeans to other countries. But eventually Japan starts a policy of isolationism, meaning that they don't really want anything to do with the West. And we see that in China too, right? We see the Canton system, where the Chinese kind of keep the Westerners at the port of Guangzhou, or Canton, we would call it, and the Japanese are doing the same thing. Nagasaki is going to be an important city for trade, but foreign merchants not really allowed into the interior of the country. There's no uniform currency, no like Japanese dollar, no yen, no real uniform law system. So you can see, even though the shogun is reunified, you know, it's not really a centralized state like we would see in Europe. You know, however, and this seems like a paradox really, Japan's one of the most urbanized country in the world. So they're not super industrial. You're not going to be seeing, you know, steam-powered factories or tall buildings, but it's very urbanized in that most people are living in cities. So most of the population is condensed into these Japanese cities. So not super industrial, but very urban. And while the merchants are the lowest class of all classes, they do start to see a period of growth going into the 1700s and 1800s. But we're going to see on the next slide how the social structure is organized. So as I mentioned, it's a feudal system, and Japan's going to keep that feudal system much later than other kind of what we would call, you know, progressive countries, I guess. Really, Japan and Russia kind of keep that for a while longer than most other European countries, or, you know, the United States. So at the top we've got the shogun, kind of the warlord or king, if you want to think of him that way. Below him, the daimyo, the lords, and the samurai, which we would call the knights, and the peasants or serfs, however you want to refer to that. Below them, the merchants, and that's very Confucian, right? We said part of Confucian value is kind of a distrust as merchants. People just kind of trying to make a quick buck. But even below them are the untouchables, the ita, and there's a bunch of different names for that in Japan. The ita is just one word that I'm going to use here. But you can see some similarities to China and some similarities to the Hindu caste system with the untouchables. There is a relatively high literacy rate. We see a flourishing of the arts, woodblock printing, which is kind of imported from China. Haikus, traditional form of Japanese poetry, kabuki theater. One of the earliest forms of theater actually dates back to earlier than this. I forget actually which century, but Japan actually might be credited with the first form of theater. And we also said the Japanese may have written the first novel in the Tale of Genji. So, you know, continuity there with the arts. As we mentioned before, though, Japan becomes isolationist, kind of not wanting anything to do with foreigners. And there's a word for that we call xenophobia, or the Japanese are xenophobic, which just kind of means you're prejudiced against or hostile to or dislike foreigners, outsiders. anybody you think doesn't really belong. And to the Japanese, the outsiders mainly are the Europeans. Now they're going to get to the point where nobody comes into Japan and nobody really leaves Japan, and there's going to be laws in place to kind of regulate Japanese trade even with China. But and this is what our movie was about, the film Silence. Japan banned Christianity, and the punishment for Christianity, for the most part, was death on the spot. That Christians weren't really allowed into the country. So you can see Japan kind of closing itself off to the world. So that's the end of Japan's notes. We'll be finishing up this unit this week and testing Friday, so I hope you learned a little bit, and I hope you can take a minute to slow this down, pause it if you need to. I know I talk a little bit fast, but hopefully you're able to use this as a resource.